Hi everyone, my name is Zohal and I'm a legal intern at Tsang and Associates. Today we're going to be interviewing caseworkers Margaret and Miriam, and we're going to be talking about an I-601A waiver case using a specific example from a case that we all worked on. What is the main difference between an I-601 and an I-601A?
For an I-601, it can waive different grounds of inadmissibility that pertain to like a medical or a health issue or a criminal charge, as opposed to I-601A is specifically for unlawful presence. And one of the other big differences is that for the I-601, it has to be done outside of the U.S. Versus the I-601A, it's all processed mostly within the U.S.
Beyond the unlawful presence, how do you qualify, or what is one of the biggest ways to qualify for an I-601A?
So one of the things is that you have to prove extreme hardship either on your U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse or parent.
Extreme hardship alone sounds very intense. So what are some ways that you can argue that someone would have extreme hardship if their spouse was forced to leave?
It does have to be extreme, so it can't be an ordinary hardship. If you're just moving, obviously you're going to have like costs associated with that move, and so that wouldn't be sufficient to prove extreme hardship. And one of the things that we focus on at our firm is that we try to argue many different hardships and as many as a client qualifies for.
In this specific case, we argued financial, emotional, and medical hardship for the client. And as we can see from here, they did provide a lot of documentation, and I reviewed some of it, and it was very sensitive information. So how do you guys get this information from the clients?
It's a very sensitive conversation, and we also invite the applicant to bring their family or their children if they have any, and we kind of just huddle, and at first it does take a little bit of time for the client to just share all of this information. And it takes like some sensitivity. I think Joseph is really good about just, cracking jokes and making the client feel at ease. Because you can't just start and be like, what are your hardships? What are all your traumas? And I think it's like a cultural thing too, that sometimes these families have gone through a lot, and to them it's kind of normal. Like they're used to going through all of these challenges, and they're kind of humble, they're not going to be like, they don't want to seem like they're victimizing themselves. So we do have to emphasize, like, we kind of need to know everything in order to help you. Otherwise, like, if you're holding back, it can hurt your case.
What would you guys say were some of the pros and cons about this case?
The weaknesses or the cons? One for sure was the fact that they didn't have any children together. So sometimes when they have children, it's easier, like the extreme hardship is a lot more evident. And then we were arguing a lot of different hardships, but on their own, I feel like they weren't necessarily strong. So, for example, she did have different health conditions, but they weren't like necessarily extreme. Of course, if you just want to look at one aspect of her life, maybe that doesn't show, but it's all intertwined. So it's like the psychological, the emotional, the financial is all tied together and affects one another, and it overlaps, and it's all kind of just like a ripple effect.
We used the psychological evaluation. Another argument that we made in the case was that if the applicant were not allowed to stay, the petitioner would have to leave to the home country of the applicant. And we kind of argue all the challenges that the applicant or the petitioner would have at the home country. Our petitioner didn't have any family, like both parents had passed away, so we really had to make an emotional plea to the officer so that the applicant would be allowed to stay. I think one of the strengths was really pleading emotionally for this case, on top of like the financial and the medical hardships. Emotion takes a big toll, like, for these cases.
Yeah, there's kind of a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear. They filed it. It took a really long time to put this whole case together. And then recently they got the request for evidence, which was basically they gave us, after waiting for like 3 to 4 years, they gave us 30 days to respond. So now it was another like emotional cycle and like trying to re-update everything, remake arguments, because a lot has changed in their lives from 4 years ago.
What was the RFE specifically asking for?
It was kind of general, but it was questioning, again, like the extreme hardship. It was kind of saying like, we're not necessarily buying it, like show us more. And that's kind of challenging because sometimes within the RFE they gave you specific things that you could just work off of, but because we don't know like what specifically are they challenging, then we're basically redoing everything. So we got together again with like attorney Joseph and the account manager Gabby, and we basically decided to strengthen every argument that's still applied and update everything. And then if there was new pieces of information, to include that as well. Instead of having one qualifying relative, now they had two qualifying relatives. So we're basically going to attack it at all angles because this is like their last chance at this point. Like they're either going to get approved or they're going to get denied, but it's like real now.
I feel like also when we make our attorney briefs, they're like 50, 60 pages. So it's not like a 10-page, it's a 50, 60-page argument.
Yeah.
That the officer hopefully reads through
Yeah.
or skims through, who knows, and we don't know what argument they're going to land on. So it is important to make every argument as strong as possible.
So one thing I noticed in the argument, of course, we focused on all the extreme hardship if the spouse were to be relocated, but we also touched on the hardship if they both had relocated. So is that something that's required? Is that something we do to strengthen the argument?
Yeah, we argue both scenarios. Because these cases are discretionary, then we don't really know like what's gonna get to that soft spot of the officer. What are they gonna focus on? Or if they attack this argument, we're gonna be like, yep, we covered that, but that's why we're saying.
Yeah, and that argument alone requires a lot of research because you're researching that country's unemployment rate, you're researching their healthcare system. So it is very detailed, and not only that, you have to make sure all the research you're conducting, it's recent news, recent information, so it's very specific. Have RFEs become pretty common, or is it a good sign if your case receives an RFE? Because there's that whole saying, no news is good news. So when you guys receive one, does it worry you guys or anything like that?
I think having seen like so many different scenarios, we definitely don't panic when we get an RFE. To us, we just take it as like, okay, like the officer is looking at the case, but we also don't take it lightly, right? Like we're like, nah, this is normal. Like let's just submit a couple things. But at the same time, because it's different as opposed to a client. Like a client sees a request for evidence and they freak out because it does look scary, right? You're like, you see all this language, but of course we see these all the time that we're able to kind of tell like, okay, this is standard. They always include that same statement for every single one. So I think, yeah, it's no reason to panic. There's still hope, but you do have to do your best to respond.
So after the RFE was filed, how long did it take for you guys to hear back?
Almost a month or so. So we got the email with the approval notice, and it was almost like, I remember sitting there, like, I couldn't believe it because it was kind of uncertain. We didn't know which way it was going to go, but we know that we did our best. So I know I was like, Miriam,
they were like, did you see?
And then, you know, along with Gabby and Joseph, they shared the news with the client, who was like, you know, you can imagine, like emotional, happy, like also nervous about the next steps. But it was definitely a win for our entire team. There was so many people that worked on it as a team. So it was just, yeah, it was a nice moment to kind of like celebrate. And then, yeah.
Yeah, that's so sweet. Well, we hope this Q&A session was helpful for you, and thank you for watching. Bye.
Bye.